The author said, benefit. Allah said, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Allah does not obligate a soul but with its capability. Allah does not make you accountable to do, or does not make a soul accountable to do anything but its capacity or its ability. If you are not able to do something, then you would not be accountable to do it. You would not be obligated to do it. But what does it mean to be able or not be able? That's what we want to talk about. The slave is not accountable to do what it cannot do. That includes what is itself impossible, like two opposites at the same time. Can you do that? Can you stand up and sit down at the same time? No. So you're not accountable to do such a thing. Yani, you're not charged with such a thing because you're not charged with doing something that you're unable to do. Also, what is itself possible, but not for the slave, like the creation of a body, creating something, bringing something into existence from nothing. Can you do that? You cannot do that. So you're not accountable to do that. You're not obligated to do that. You're not sinful if you don't do that. Let's look at some other examples. If you don't have water, are you obligated to make wudu? No. How are you going to make wudu if you don't have water? Or if you're missing a limb, a foot, or a hand, are you obligated to wash that foot or hand? No, because you don't have it. You're not able to. Or if you have a loan that's due, but you don't have the money to pay it. Not that you have the money and you're procrastinating, but you literally do not have the money. Then are you sinful for not paying it? No, because you cannot pay it. You're unable. لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Allah does not make a soul accountable to do but what it is able to do. As for what will not happen because Allah knew and willed for it not to happen, are you accountable for that? Allah knew it wouldn't happen and He willed for it not to happen. Like what? Such as a blasphemer believing and a sinner being obedient, meaning Allah knew and willed for him to be a blasphemer and He knew and willed for him to be a sinner. So then he wouldn't be a believer and he wouldn't be obedient. So is this blasphemer and this sinner, are they accountable because Allah knew about their blasphemy and sin and He willed for that blasphemy and sin? There is no doubt that one is still accountable for it. That means then that you have no excuse in the knowledge of Allah if you fell short, and you have no excuse in the will of Allah. You can't say, well, Allah knew, so, or Allah willed, so why should I be accountable? So there is no doubt that one is still accountable for that. If Allah did not will for something to happen, then are you excused or are you accountable? If Allah didn't will for you to pray while you were able to, are you excused or are you accountable? You're accountable for that. You can't say, "Oh, Allah willed for me not to pray, so why should I be accountable? How come I'm not excused?" So if your question is why, explain that for me. Make it clear for me. How come I'm not excused if Allah knew that I would sin and He willed for me to sin? Why am I not excused? If that's your question, then the answer is, and it's going to come back, you're not excused if Allah knew and willed for you to sin because you didn't know that Allah knew and willed for you to sin. What did you know? You knew what Allah ordered you to do and not to do. And you didn't know what Allah knew and you didn't know what Allah willed until you chose for yourself to disobey Allah. Then when you choose for yourself to disobey Allah, you knew that Allah knew that you would disobey, and Allah willed for you to disobey before you were ever created. And you're accountable for what you chose for yourself. When you knew beforehand that Allah forbade you from doing such and such. That's what you knew. You knew that yesterday, for example. You knew yesterday that such and such matter was haram. And then here you come today and you still know that it's haram. Yesterday you didn't know what Allah willed. You didn't know what Allah knew. Here you come today, you still know it's haram. You don't know what Allah willed. You don't know what Allah knew. So what you're going to do, if you choose for yourself to disobey, then you can't say, well, Allah willed for me to disobey. I should be excused. That's clear. The able one has two types of ability. Now here, make sure you pay attention. The able one has two types of ability, which linguistically means qudra, power. Ability, istita'a is qudra. Ability is power. So, what is ability? That's what we're going to talk about now. You're not accountable to do what you're unable to do, then what is ability? What does it mean to be able to do something? Ability, istita'a, has two usages for us as Sunni Muslims. The Sunnis said there's the true inner power by which one acts, the power that you find in yourself by which you can move your hand and look around and wiggle your toes, etc. This is a type of ability, this power to move and act. That's one type of ability. And then there's another type of ability, which is the outward means and tools by which one achieves. So there's two types of ability, an inner ability and an outer ability, or an inward ability and an outward ability. The inward ability is the power by which you can move. The outward ability means your means, your tools, the things by which you achieve what you want to do. You have money, then you can do something, for example. It's a means, it's a tool. You have a vehicle, then you can drive somewhere, for example. It's a means. If you don't have a vehicle, you cannot drive. If you don't have money, you cannot buy something. for example. You don't have the means. You don't have the ability. But that ability, the second one now, we're not talking about the power to move. It's not the ability we're talking about now. Now we're talking about the means to achieve. Then which one makes you accountable? Here you need to be careful. The deviant groups, they thought that it's number one, the true inner power by which one acts. They think that's the ability that makes you accountable. And that's not the ability that makes you accountable. The power by which you move, that's not the ability that makes you accountable. The ability that makes you accountable is having the means to do something. Why? How come the first one is not the ability that makes you accountable? Because if you don't have the means, you won't be able to do something. It's not just having the power to move. So if you don't have the water, you won't be able to make wudu, right? If you don't have a car, you won't be able to take a drive. The power or the ability that makes you accountable is having means, not just the power to move. And that's going to become clearer now, inshallah. So there's two types of ability, the inner power by which one acts, and the outward means and tools by which one achieves. However, accountability and Allah's order, Allah's command, accountability and God's command are related to only one of those two. Which one? The apparent outward ability, the means. Why? How come the means? Because the means to do the deed, that's the ability that exists before you even do the deed. The means and the tools to do the deed, that's the ability that exists before you actually literally do the deed. Your power to move doesn't exist before you actually move. That's our belief. Your power to move doesn't exist before you actually move. Your ability to make wudu or your accountability to make wudu is by having the water, not by being able to move, because you have the water before you do the wudu. So the means are existing before you do the deed. And also, what comes before you do the deed also? The command to do the deed. So follow me here. A command to do something comes. Allah commands us to pray and to fast and to make purification, etc. So the command to do something, it has to come before we actually do it, right? Yes. The command to do something has to come before we actually do it. Also, what exists before you actually do something? What also exists before you do something? The means to do it, the tools to do it. If you have them already, then the command to do the deed comes before you do the deed. The tools you need to do the deed exist before you do the deed. So now you're accountable to do the deed. So then what about your power to move? Usually Allah will give you the power to move at the time you want to move. At the moment you want to move, Allah will create for you the power to move. So this is not the ability that makes you accountable. that power that doesn't exist before you do the deed, the power that does not exist before you do the deed, that's not the ability that makes you accountable. Accountability and Allah's command are related to the apparent outward ability that precedes the deeds. That is the soundness of means and the soundness of tools and health and organs and senses and instruments and access. All the things by which you achieve some act. Accountability and the religious orders are relevant to having this type of ability because one normally has the inner power to do the deed when he has the outward means to achieve it. This means that what exists prior to the deed, what exists before you actually do the deed, is what might be called power or ability. This means that what exists prior to the deed is what might be called power or ability. The means, that is, the tools, might be called power or ability. And there's no difference about that for Ahlul Sunnah. But the power, the tools and the means are not the inward power by which one acts. So, An-Nasafi said, ويقع هذا الاسم على سلامة الأسباب والآلات والجوارح. This name, ability, could also apply to soundness of means, tools, and organs. وصحة التكليف تعتمد هذه الاستطاعة, and the validity of accountability depends on this ability. As will be said, when one has the means, but it was not willed that he did the obligation, so he has the means, he has the water for wudu, he has the health, he has the limbs, he can walk, he can move, everything. But it was not willed that he did the obligation. He didn't pray. He's just stayed playing video games, just stayed watching a game or watching a movie or playing chess or trying to get home and not wanting to pray outside or pray at work or take a ghusl at work for a sister whose period stopped at work and the prayer time goes out before she goes home. When one has the means, like that person, that sister could go into the bathroom, take some water, take a ghusl in the stall. She has the means. It's a little bit of trouble though. When one has the means, but it was not willed that he did the obligation, then he was negligent. He cannot blame the will of Allah. He was negligent. Like we said, you don't know what Allah willed. He has no excuse in the will of Allah because Allah said, وَقَالُوا لَوْ شَاءَ الرَّحْمَنُ مَا عَبَدْنَاهُمْ. And they said, had Ar-Rahman willed, we would not have worshipped those idols. So they're making an excuse in the will of Allah, those pagans. And they were being stubborn in this statement of theirs. مَا لَهُمْ بِذَلِكَ مِنْ عِلْمٍ. They do not have any knowledge of what Ar-Rahman willed. So they cannot use the will of Allah as an excuse. The slaves do not know what Allah willed until it happens, except by revelation. What they do know is what they have been commanded and forbidden, like we said. Not what Allah willed. They don't know that, what Allah willed. Not until it happens. So they are accountable to do what Allah commanded, not what He willed. You will do what Allah willed, whether you want to or you don't want to. So you're not accountable to do what Allah willed. You're accountable to do what Allah commanded you. And you're accountable to refrain from what Allah forbade you. When something happens, the slave then knows what it was that Allah knew in eternity. The inward ability that exists when the deed exists is the actual ability by which the deed occurs, that inward ability, that inner power. It is a quality within us that Allah creates at the instant of the deed, not before the deed. So that's the right belief. Because if you confirm having the inner power to do the deed before you do the deed, then you're going to be saying that you create your own deed. You don't have the power, the inner power to do a deed before you do the deed. Rather, you have the inner power to do a deed at the moment of doing the deed. It is a quality within us that Allah creates, that inner power is a quality within us that Allah creates at the instant, the moment, not before, at the instant of the deed. Upon intending to acquire the deed, so when are we able to move or do something? When we intend, we want to do the deed, and after having the means to fulfill the deed, and also actually having the means to do whatever it is you want to do, then you'll be able to do it normally. So that is the ability that's meant in the saying of Allah Ta'ala, مَا كَانُوا يَسْتَطِيعُونَ السَّمْعَ. They were unable to hear. They did not have the ability to hear. Is this ayah saying they were deaf? No. In this verse, those people were dispraised despite having the means and tools to hear. They had the means and the tools to hear. So it truly means that they were unable to accept what they heard, although it was true, although there was evidence for it. Lacking the means is not intended here when the ayah says, مَا كَانُوا يَسْتَطِيعُونَ السَّمْعَ. They were unable to hear. This ayah about them being unable to hear does not mean that they did not have the means and the tools to hear. Lacking the means is not intended here because the implication of the verse is that they were negligent. And if they were negligent, then they did indeed have the means. You are negligent when you have the means and then you don't do what you have to do. Thus, here they lacked the actual power, the inner power to do the deed of hearing. And one is still accountable when he lacks the actual power while having the means. That means they're hearing the truth at the time it came to them was not created in them. They did not have the ability at the time, at the moment. One is still accountable when he lacks the actual power while having the means. So don't let this chapter confuse you. Some statements here might confuse a person who doesn't lock in some simple points. Like here, where we said, this whole underline. One is still accountable when he lacks the actual power while having the means. So write down for yourself what's correct is that you're accountable even if you lack the inner power. That's the correct belief of Ahlul Sunnah. Was the deviant people who said different from this. They said if you lack the inner power, you're not accountable. We say to them, yes, you are. They would say, how would we be accountable if we're not able? And Allah says, La yukallifullahu nafsan illa wus'aha. Allah doesn't charge a soul but with its capacity. So our answer is that ability in the ayah refers to having tools and means, doesn't refer to the inner power. When you have the tools and the means, then you are accountable. Think about it in terms of your worldly affairs, for example. Even if you remove the issue of the threat of God being upon you, let's say you had some business to take care of. You got some errands you need to run, you have some places you need to go, you have some etc. things you need to do, and you have all the means to do it. You have the money, you have the ride, etc. There's no reason for you to be not be able to do it. But then you don't do it. So doesn't that mean you were negligent? So it's not the inner power, that the ability to move itself, that makes you accountable. It's having the means to do it. When you have the means and you don't follow through, then you're accountable. Yani, then you're negligent. Then you're negligent. When you lack the means and you don't follow through, even if you have the inner power but you lack the means, then you're not negligent. Then you're not negligent. This is what the Mu'tazila could not understand. They, as well as the Dirariya and many of the Karramiya, said that this inward ability exists before the deed. So don't mix that. This inner power, what's correct is what? It does not exist before the deed. It exists at the instant of the deed, at the moment of the deed. That means, for example, every word that I'm saying to you now, the inner power, my inner power to say those words is existing at the time of me saying them, not before. Allah creates in me the ability to do those things because I have the means. Usually, when you have the means, you will be able. So the Mu'tazila and others, they said that this inward ability exists before the deed. That's a blunder on their part. That leads to them saying that the human creates his own deeds. Except that the Dirariya said that it must exist with the deed as well. That, I'm not going to go into that for now. Maybe it'll come back. So those people who said that it's the inner power that makes you accountable, and that inner power exists before you do the deed, their fallacy, meaning the way they tried to argue their mistake, was from 2 points of view. Textual, they had something from the Quran that they tried to use, and mental, meaning they had something that they thought was a rational argument. As for their misinterpretation of the saying of Allah, خُذُوا مَا آتَيْنَاكُمْ بِقُوَّةٍ, take what we have given you with power. So that's an ayah. How did they misinterpret this ayah for their own nefarious reasons? They said Taking with power, as the ayah commands, yani Allah commanded the Israelites to take the Torah with biquwah, yani with resolve, take it with firm resolve. But here we're just going to use the word power. So they said taking with power with firm resolve would only happen if the power existed before the taking. Take with power. So there must be some power, and then I take, like taking something with a hand. There must be a hand first. The hand must exist before the actual taking. So the ayah says, خُذُوا مَا آتَيْنَاكُمْ بِقُوَّةٍ. Take what we have given you with power. So that power must have been existing prior. The answer is that the hand counts as soundness of means. That hand that they used as an example, that's an example of having the means. It's the means that exist before the deed, not the power itself. This is what must be prior to the deed, the means to do it. As for the actual power, it is a quality by which the hand is able. The hand itself will be able to move at the instant of the move, not before. Had this type of ability existed before the deed, had this inner ability existed before the deed, then Al-Khadir would not have said to Moses ahead of time, إِنَّكَ لَن تَسْتَطِيعَ مَعِيَ صَبْرًا. You surely will be unable to be patient with me. You will be unable. You shall be unable. So before the deed, Al-Khadir told Musa before the deed, you won't have the ability at the time of the deed. Because his ability to be patient later should be confirmed prior to the deed. According to them, they said the ability to do the deed exists before the deed. So how did Al-Khadir tell Musa before the deed that he won't have the ability? According to them, then Al-Khadir should be mistaken here. They said, yes, it is the inner power that exists before the deed. Then how did Al-Khadir say to Musa before the deed, you won't have that inner power? So there's an ayah from the Quran that's very clearly contradicting those people and confirming for Ahlul Sunnah the right belief, which is what? The inner power to do the deed exists at the instant of the deed, not before. Furthermore, Moses would not have made his ability to be patient conditional by saying, Satajiduni insha Allahu sabira. If Allah willed, you will find me patient. So there's a condition. If Allah willed, that's a condition. And making a condition is for the future. So for sure, in these ayahs, we're talking about having the ability to do the deed at the moment of the deed, not before. Not before the deed. When it comes to the inner power. When you make a condition, the condition is for the future. Say, if you do such and such, then I will, and then you're going to see if he's going to do it or not. So conditions are for the future. Al-Khadir said, you won't be able to be patient with me. You won't have the means in the future. And then Musa told him, if Allah willed, you will find me patient in the future. Meaning you will find me having the power. So all of that is clear evidence that the power to do the deed exists at the instant of the deed, not before. The inner power. And that's not the power that makes you accountable. As for what they considered to be a mental argument, As for what they considered to be a mental argument, they said the ability to do the deed must be prior to the deed, because the slave is accountable to do the deed before the deed itself exists. For example, the blasphemer is ordered with belief. So the command for him to believe exists before he believes. If he has the power to believe, they say, if he has the power to believe before he does, then what we say is correct. The ability to do the deed exists before the deed, the inner power. That's what they say to us. If he has the power to believe before believing, then what we say is correct. The ability to act exists before the act. On the other hand, if he were unable to believe, although he was commanded to, then he would be accountable to do what he is unable to do. Although Allah said, "La yukallifullahu nafsan illa wus'aha." Allah does not make a soul accountable except for what is in its ability. They say to us, one should therefore be excused according to your claim. They say to us, according to you, a person shouldn't be accountable because you deny that he's accountable by his inner power. They say to us, one should therefore be excused according to your claim, you Sunnis, or else punishing him would be unjust and unwise. He gets punished for what he wasn't even accountable for. We say, to say that the ability to do the deed exists before the deed, before the actual deed itself, leads to deeming the slave independent of Allah. He has the power to act before he acts, so he doesn't need Allah according to that. And that is impossible. And that's what the Mu'tazila believe. That's why they're saying these things. Hence, saying that the true ability must exist before the deed, the true ability must exist before the deed, saying that leads to invalidating the religious laws, because it means the human creates his own deeds. And it leads to rendering the address of command meaningless. Therefore, the validity of what Ahlul Sunnah said is confirmed, and the invalidity of what the Mu'tazila and their fanatics said is apparent. وَسُبْحَانَ اللَّهِ وَبِحَمْدِهِ